In this video, I'll give a demonstration of how to use the advanced user interface. The purpose of the advanced UI is it gives you more insight into exactly how Edexia operates and how Edexia is thinking while it is marking. The point of this is for two core reasons. First of all, you can actually start to begin to understand Edexia and potentially even trust it more. But more importantly, it also helps you improve Edexia, because the core issue with marking is the same as getting a, say, teacher's assistant to mark. Initially, they'll have a different thought process when it comes to marking than you intended. And so the key initial step when utilizing Edexia is to align its thought process with your own. And the way you do that is through using the advanced UI. To access the advanced UI, you can come to your profile at the top right. Then just go to your marking preferences. Underneath marking preferences, you can toggle on the advanced UI and make sure that the AI criteria suggestions is also toggled on. And I'll come back to exactly what that means in a second. Then just press save. Once you've saved, you can return back to your assessment dashboard by pressing the home button in the top left. Then you can either reopen a batch that you're currently marking or create a new batch like we've already gone over in the getting started video. But now when you go back to the batch, you'll have a slightly different view. Firstly, you'll notice in the feedback sheet, you'll also get a detailed Edexia AI reasoning toggle. And this is where you'll be able to see why Edexia is providing that mark. But more importantly, when you go over to the criteria, you'll see a completely different format. Instead of the QCAA criteria, what we're displaying here is exactly what it is evaluating when it is marking the student's assignment. And so this is the key step where what we are trying to attempt to do is get the AI to learn the exact same thought process that the teacher wants to use when marking. And to do that, we need a format which has the capacity to encapsulate all of that information. We call this the unpacked criteria, where we're trying to really further define exactly what it means to get every single mark range of every dot point. The way we've structured this currently is in a checklist-based system because in the science subjects, that seemed to be what science teachers preferred. However, we will be exploring additional frameworks, especially when it comes to humanities-based subjects, to encapsulate more nuance in the marking process. But with the checklist-based system, the way we've structured it is all of the points at the top are questions which will indicate that it's in the 5 to 6 range. Whereas questions in, say, this area indicate that it's actually only a 3 to 4. And so we've worded the questions at the top as things that the student can do well, whereas the questions in the 3 to 4, the 1 to 2 range, are things that the student would have to do wrong to get that mark. So in the top range, if each aspect of the claim is identified and explained briefly, it's indicating a 5 to 6. However, if some of the core aspects are not fully explained, it's indicating a 3 to 4. And so how it works is Edexia will go through and answer every single one of these questions, and then the lowest mark range with a question that is answered yes is provided. So let's say all of these are answered yes, but then every other question below is answered no. Well, then a 5 to 6 is given. But let's say all of these are answered yes apart from this last one, but instead maybe this one is answered yes, then a 3 to 4 is given, and so on. And if this question down here is answered yes, then a 0 is given. So it's the lowest mark range with a question answered yes is provided for that given dot point. Another thing to note is we also provide steps to the AI on exactly how to answer each of the questions, especially when that question is more nuanced. And this will help the AI actually follow the exact same train of thought that a teacher would. Some of them will have limited steps. However, one way of increasing the accuracy of an answer to a question is by bulking out the steps. And so you'll see an initial version of the criteria, and we've based this on the QCAA yearly reports. And as I was saying, the main way to improve Edexia's accuracy and get it to align with your thought process is to refine this criteria. There are two ways to do this. The first way is the much more manual and time intensive, where you can come up here and press edit criteria and then manually go through and actually edit the text here. However, this would be a very time intensive process, and so we've also developed another feature, and that was that AI criteria suggested improvements. How these work is while you're actually moderating Edexia, we'll monitor those moderations and use that to refine the criteria. So the easiest way to see this is with an example. Let's say you're using the advanced UI when you're first marking an assignment. Just as before, you would look at the assignment, look at the criteria, and then actually see if you agree with Edexia's interpretation of the mark. And let's say you actually disagree with the mark range it's provided to the research question. Let's say you actually think it should be a 3 to 4 because they have not clearly defined how they will quantify the relationship. You can then send that feedback, and like before, it will further first update the justification and feedback for this specific dot point. However, the added feature now is that after a couple seconds, you'll also see a notification up here in the criteria. Because what Edexia has done is it's taken its initial assessment, it's looked back at the assignment, and then it's looked at the correction that you've just made, and then it's seen why it got it wrong. And then it goes back to the criteria and sees, how can I improve my criteria to reflect the way the teacher is thinking? And so it's actually going to propose a change to the criteria instead of you having to write it up. And then with this proposed change, occasionally it'll add questions, but a lot of time it's also just going to add more steps to a question. Because if the issue was that a question was wrong, it'll correct the question. If the issue was that it was missing an entire another question, it's not even considering something, it'll add a question. But if the issue was it was just actually not answering a question correctly, it'll try and add more steps in detail to increase the probability of the AI following the same thought process. And with this proposed change, you can then either edit it if you don't think it's perfect, or you can accept it by pressing this tick button, or you can ignore the suggestion. And then once you start changing the criteria, you'll then need to save this criteria somewhere. So press save and close, and this is where you're presented with three options. If you just want to save this criteria for this single batch, maybe it's just a one-off time you're doing this assessment, you can just save it to this batch. However, if you want to save this for future personal use, maybe you administer this assessment every year, you can save it to your personal profile with this second option here. But if you're, say, using this as an organization and there's a large number of teachers all doing the exact same assessment, you can actually save it for your organization. That way, everyone in your organization can use the exact same criteria, and if they're using the advanced UI as well, they can also improve the criteria themselves. And so you can also save to your organization. When you select how you want to save it, you can also just name it. So maybe this is the chemistry year 12 IA3. And then it will close the window. So now whenever you make a new batch of assignments, when you actually select your criteria, you can now actually go to either your custom criteria if you save it to your personal profile, or your organization criteria if you save it to your organization. So one important note here is if your head of science has already created your organization criteria, make sure that you're actually using that criteria when you're marking, and especially if we're using the advanced UI, you actually cleared it with your head of science that they're happy with you to refine the criteria as well. But going back to the actual marking, the way you would use this advanced criteria is when you first start utilizing Edexia, you would turn on the advanced criteria so you can improve Edexia's accuracy. And so as you're marking and moderating, Edexia is constantly proposing changes to the criteria, you're reviewing those changes and you're accepting or denying them, and then you're continuously refining Edexia's unpacked criteria or its thought process until it's actually approaching that 100% accuracy mark. One small tool we've added to make this process easier when refining is you can actually view exactly how Edexia is answering these questions. So underneath this toggle here, we've provided Edexia's answers and its reasoning for each of the answers to the individual questions, because this can help give you some more insight as to where Edexia is getting wrong if you're struggling to actually improve its accuracy for a certain dot point. But then you'd go through that process of marking and moderating and continuously refining the criteria, and then once you're at a point where you think it's effectively 100% accurate and you want to toggle back to that basic view where it's a lot simpler, you can go back to your settings, to your marking preferences, and then you can either toggle off just the suggested improvements. So this will now stop actually suggesting changes to the criteria, but then you can also toggle off the advanced view. If you like to keep the advanced view on but not get suggestions, so maybe you want to see the criteria still and you want to see the reasoning of Edexia still, you can still do that. However, if you want to simplify the marking process even further, you can turn that off, and then when you go back to the assignment, it will now just be in that basic view that you initially saw when you're first getting started. So that's the advanced UI, and these are the key features that will need to be utilized to improve Edexia's accuracy. A common use case is that the head of science will actually create the criteria the first time the school uses it, and then they'll actually refine the criteria themselves and then share that to the other science teachers, and then all the other science teachers can use the basic UI. Another common use case is occasionally the whole science department will want to collectively refine the organization criteria, and so they'll all utilize the advanced UI and improve it until they're happy that it gets to a point of accuracy, and then they'll turn off the AI suggestion suggestions. One thing that is important to note is as you start creating custom criteria, it's important that you start managing those custom criteria, because you don't want to end up with multiple copies of the same criteria for the same assignment and accidentally end up editing one when you should be editing the other. If you're just using this as an individual, it should be relatively easy to keep track. And you can also go to your settings and go to custom criteria, and then you'll be able to see all of the custom criteria you have, and you can delete old ones and make sure you only have one new copy for each assignment that you're using it for. However, if you're using this as a organization or as a school and you want to be using it across a department, it's important that every user is careful when they start creating criteria to make sure that one hasn't already been created. And so when making a new batch of assessment, just make sure that you actually look at the organizational criteria tab to see if a criteria has been created before. That way you don't end up with multiple duplicates of the same criteria. Another thing to note is when you change a criteria in one subject that is related to another, let's say you have biology and chemistry, they both use very similar criteria, and so a lot of the changes that you use to optimize your biology criteria might also correspond to chemistry. In this case, we'd still recommend having separate criteria for each subject because there usually are some specific things that each subject is looking for, especially when it comes to dot points where it links to the relevant part of the syllabus, which will be different between subjects. In this case, just go to the subject's criteria which you've refined, copy that section, then go to the new subject and then manually edit the criteria, pasting in any of the relevant questions and steps. If you'd like, you can also request for our team to manually do this for you. So those are all the core features in the advanced. As always, if you get lost or have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And if you have any ideas or feedback, I would love to hear it because we continuously want to improve this platform to have a greater positive impact on your school and the education system as a whole.